Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Dale Dougherty was the organizer of the world's first ever web developers conference, the World Wide Web Wizards Workshop, all the way back in July of 1993. This was the conference where Tim Berners-Lee and Mark Andreessen met for the first time, and it was worth speaking to Dale just to hear the behind the scenes of that encounter. But Dale Dougherty was also the co-founder of the web's first ever commercial website, Global Network Navigator, or GNN. Today, Dale is probably best known as the founder of Maker Magazine, Maker Fairs, and the entire Maker movement. Quick side note, this is going to be the final episode of this calendar year. As I did last year, I'm going to take the next 2 weeks off. So look for a new episode January 4th, a brand new researched and written episode. Until then, please enjoy this fascinating interview with Dale Dougherty. Dale Dougherty, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start at the beginning, going all the way back to maybe meeting Tim OReilly, getting started with Tim OReilly, and getting started with O'Reilly Media.
Sure. O'Reilly Media really started as O'Reilly and Associates, and it was outside of Boston, suburb of Newton. Mm-hmm. And Tim worked out of the loft in his barn, which is kind of like a converted garage. And it was a technical writing firm. And I first met Tim because I came in to take a job on a contract to write a manual. Now, I should tell you that I'm really not I had an English background, so I was a writer more than an engineer. Tim was a classics major, and to some degree, I think what we figured out is we could, by asking lots of questions and asking people to give us better answers each time, we could understand what engineers were talking about and try to write manuals in layman's terms so they could understand how to do something. And so, early on we were writing manuals, not books, and we were hired as contractors to do that. What happened during that time, though, is we began writing introductory manuals for Unix systems, which was in the mid '80s. Unix was on departmental computing. It was called mini computers, and so Tim kind of saw an opportunity to obtain the rights or save the rights to the work we were doing, so that we could possibly resell it, and I had the idea or interest maybe of taking those books and seeing if we could sell them someday. And I think that to make a short story of it, we did our first books as the nutshell handbooks, they were called, and we printed them off a laser printer and bound them with staples, and we brought them to a Unix expo in New York City, and we sold them for $5 a pop. And it was one of the best feelings I've ever had in my life. It was at a trade show where people walked around looking at big computers, big displays, big companies. And we were this sort of little booth, and we had a few titles were programming with curses. It was reading and writing term cap entries, and I think it was learning the VI editor. They were pretty obscure, but the people kind of liked that there were books on these topics for a system that we're learning, and that I will say is more for the future of my work. But the third book that we produced was Managing Projects with Make, and it was about how to package up programs and make utility in Unix. But Tim and I also wrote a book at the time based on the tools we were using, and called Unix Text Processing, and it was for another publisher. But in the business of producing manuals, we were using the utilities that were on Unix to write the manuals, and so we got really familiar with the Unix system, which in our view, it comes out of Bell Labs, but it certainly was an operating system and it had programming utilities. But it also, because they were a research organization, they had developed typesetting tools that allowed you to, for them to write their reports, allowed us to write manuals. And so Unix text processing was about how to create books using those tools.
So just to be clear, though, you guys got into doing tech and computer books and manuals just sort of by accident. You just sort of kind of fell back into it, sort of?
Well, I don't know by accident completely. I mean, Tim had a partner that he started the company with, who had already gone or left the business by the time. But the partner knew programming and Tim knew writing, and they kind of worked together. And I was basically self-taught in these areas, and you'd say Tim was as well. But it wasn't something I took in school, but I began to figure things out. And I actually thought, I wish, my takeaway was I wish they had taught this differently in school, because they kind of said you had to be good at math and a lot of other things which I didn't think of myself as being good at. But when I got into even the minimal amount of programming I did, it was, hey, this is just logic, and I had taken a lot of philosophy and other things. So it seemed to be a really interesting exercise, how to solve a problem writing code.
Well, one thing that we should point out about those Unix machines as well is they had TCP/IP, and so Unix machines were how most people got on the internet in the 80s. I'm wondering if you could tell us the story of your learning about the internet and then later on learning about the web.
Yeah, well, in the time we're doing this, Unix had all these networking utilities, and you could connect them, and we were probably using just dial-up modems to download Usenet news and do email. Some of our early books were like Managing UCP, which was sort of the utility used to connect some of the computers in a local network and share files and various things. All command line oriented. I'm trying to think. We began. The easiest thing for me to remember in some ways is OReilly was working on a book called The Whole Internet User Guide and Catalog.
Right.
And kind of referencing Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog. And we really kind of were beginning to see that there were users interested in the internet, and more people were getting access to it. So we wanted to kind of give them a field guide for navigating it. And so that's in some ways we were already using the internet like as a means to connect things, but then almost like the big eye in internet started to take off, and we were looking at that as well. When we were working on that book, I had met Tim Berners-Lee earlier, and I had really taken and appreciated the web, and so I remember having a lunch with Tim Berners-Lee and Tim OReilly in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because Tim was teaching at MIT for a summer program, and I really wanted to get a chapter in the Whole Internet book on the web, and I think we succeeded in doing that. Mm-hmm. The early utilities for the internet were things like Gopher, FTP for file transfer. Gopher was sort of the information system, and at the time when the web was emerging, there are a lot of people, especially administrators and more geeky types, that dismissed the web and were really fond of Gopher. One, it was a little bit easy to set up. It was kind of a hierarchical file system approach. You just put files in the right places, and that's what you got to. And it was text-based. It could be read anywhere. And, the web was sort of breaking some of the models of a command line oriented internet.
Right.
And that they didn't like that as much.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to break the chronology here or so, but did you also hire the guy that created the Viola web browser? Did he join?
I did.
Okay.
So in about, I'll get there in one way.
Sure.
So I sort of got interested in how our books that we began publishing, like in about 85, one day books about computers should be delivered on a computer. But because we were working on a Unix system, it was a harder problem to solve. I began going to hypertext conferences. I began talking to vendors who had like large computer documentation. At the time it was like Silicon Graphics and others. They were thinking, well, yeah, that'd be great if we didn't have to deliver bulky manuals. And O'Reilly was in the business of, like, at this time, things like the X Window system and Unix were, the Unix system was a set of 7 manuals. And we were kind of in the business of improving those and licensing them out or selling them as physical books. And it was pretty clear that our customers would want, digital versions of those. But there wasn't clear how to do that. I had done an experiment just really to prove that. I took like the Unix command manual and ported it to HyperCard, and because I thought it was a sort of publishing system, that was easy for me to do this. And we actually did sell it as a product for a while. I don't think we sold that many, but it was really just a demonstration or experiment that you could do this. And so I had in my head that I needed something like HyperCard, but for Unix, and something ideally that was free, that people didn't want to pay for an expensive hypertext system just to be able to access a book. So I found Viola as a young man named Pei Wei, was at the University of California, Berkeley, and he was working on this as a project. He was a geology major. But he'd gone to the experimental computing lab and worked on their computers there to make Viola. In essence, he was trying to, in many ways, the sort of architecture of it and stuff was similar to HyperCard, and you would use a scripting language to organize content and create interactivity, create graphics and things. And, Pei was working away on it, and I thought initially that I wanted to do just a book on Viola, and that was my stated goal. I think I did sign him to a book contract to just write something about Viola. And then, I eventually formed a small group in Berkeley, a digital media group for O'Reilly, and hired him and then eventually a couple others to just sort of work on Viola. But one of the things Pei was doing, I thought, was building a system in which we could deliver content. And so I thought of it as a kind of book system or in that regard. And one day Pei introduced me to the World Wide Web and said, I built a web browser inside of Viola. So he kind of built it as an application inside his system,
right?
Like a scripting application. And that was the first time I think I had seen graphics displayed in a document. Again, what you think of it before this, the CD-ROM world is existing. It's really rich in terms of the graphics and interactivity. You call it multimedia. But the internet was pretty much a text world only. And the idea of maybe that people were distributing images on Usenet groups, but the integration of the two wasn't happening. And and that was my first exposure really to the web. And I thought, boy, this is perfect. We can not only just display text, but we can style it. We have formatted, text, and we can add graphics and layout to this. So I was really interested in that, and that's why we formed the group and we started working in that direction. And I think at the same time, I had formed a group as part of a founding people for a group called the Davenport Group, and we were trying to get a standard for computing manuals, electronic computing manuals. We needed to kind of agree on what the format of those manuals would take so that you could render them and display them online. And we settled on HTML at the time and began a group to define that kind of standard. It's sort of like an industrial standard for computing manuals. And I went to the Hypertext conference in 1991 in San Antonio, and we were going to have a Davenport group meeting there. And that's where I first met Tim Berners-Lee, who was doing a poster session about the World Wide Web because his paper on the World Wide Web was rejected by the Hypertext conference. They didn't think it was important. And that was the first time I saw that and met it and kind of understood it, and then kind of coupled with Pei implementing this as a graphical browser. I really thought this was a new direction, and I wanted to go after the web and kind of away from manuals and bigger books. And sort of the HTML was a much more complex grammar around a format for books, and eventually what became HTML was simpler, and given the bandwidth issues and other things, it just looked like a more interesting direction that I wanted to go in. And but sort of the leap ahead, seeing those two things, I kind of, Pei had built a browser. I met Berners-Lee and kind of understood the system he was building. Kind of understood it wasn't really widely appreciated. It was the people, the Go-Ververs or the web people. The hypertext community thought, well, it's not really a true hypertext system. It doesn't have this or that. And then I was looking for an application related to books. And so Pei and I worked to take the catalog from the whole Internet User's Guide and catalog to put it on HTML pages. And but what was so interesting about it at the time, and I got so excited about it, was that you clicked on a link and it took you to a server in another country, another part of the world. Mm-hmm. And so it really was kind of the first portal kind of thing that we had started. Here's a guide to resources, and the resources weren't all on that computer. They were out there. And I remember presenting it to people and saying, this is what's happening here. I just want you to know we haven't loaded all this data here. We're going out over the internet and grabbing it and displaying it here. And all we're doing is kind of using an address to locate that information and bring it here. And we went, that was 92, and in 1992, in August, we went and presented, we set up a computer at Interop in San Francisco. And we demonstrated that just to see if people thought it was interesting. We did it really to promote the book, but, hey, come over here, try this, click on this, look at this, you're interested in astronomy. Oh, here are 4 sites out there that astronomy. And of course, at the time, most of the links went to FTP sites or Gopher sites. There were a few web pages. The most famous one probably at the time was the Vatican Archive. There's someone had scanned some materials about, from the Vatican and put that up, and that was kind of a genuine website. But there weren't that many of them at the time. And, based on the feedback we got at Interop, we decided to take this more seriously and put a little more energy into it. And it actually went, we made it into a kiosk, and it went into the computer literacy bookstore in Sunnyvale, California, near San Jose. And we had it operating there so people could get sort of a taste of the internet through that kiosk. And in many ways, it was I think a shift from the internet as command line, retrieval to the internet as this sort of more visual interface where like a book or something, you saw something you were interested in, you pressed it and it went to another page or another site in this case. And it was really, I think Tim kind of used the term at the time, an information interface. And that's what we, saw there as having a lot of power. And so that kind of takes us, up through the end of 92.
Well, so just to make clear then, so you basically put this book, The Whole Internet User's Guide, onto the web as sort of
the catalog portion of it.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And so it is, in essence, really kind of the first portal because it is showing people, all right, this is what's out there to explore on the internet.
Yeah.
And so it's serving as a portal, 2 full years before even Yahoo gets started.
Yeah. And it's, we didn't have those words and we didn't care about it that way, but it was just, hey, here's a guide to the internet. And rather than, just telling you how to use tools or utilities, this was more, hey, just explore. And that's what we thought was really fun.
So again, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead in the chronology, but I'm curious to hear about the World Wide Web Wizards Workshop in 1993, which I believe is this the first meeting of web developers ever?
Yeah. So, I'd gotten to know Tim pretty well. O'Reilly, at the time, I had an office and moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. So Tim Berners-Lee was at MIT for that summer of 93. And so let me just give you a little preface. After the kiosk, I was convinced there was somehow a product in this. And I began working on that. It wasn't going to be a book product. It was something that was made for the internet. And it was, in many ways, hey, this is a catalog of things on the internet. Let's build that out and let's start writing about the internet and what you can do, what you find, and that kind of thing. And so I came up with a product idea called GNN. It's a Global Network Navigator. And we can come back to that, but what I needed for GNN to be successful is to have stable server and a stable browser. And Tim Berners-Lee had defined, I think, pretty well the basic server and the protocol HTTP and basic HTML. But in the spring, as we were working on it, and again, we were doing the early work using the Viola browser. There was a couple other browsers, like the Cello browser, which is out of the Cornell Law School, Tim Berners-Lee's command line browser. There was Lynx, which was a command line browser from Kansas.
Right.
So there were different people working on this. And in many ways, this is a kind of a critical time where control of whatever the web wasn't just in Tim's hands. So while he was the founder of it and defined the core specs, they were evolving. And in the spring, Mosaic was announced, and it came from NCSA, National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Champaign, Illinois. And that's where Mark Andreessen was, and he was the hotshot who really changed things tremendously. I think the release of that browser and the acceptance of it really started to get the web on the map. And so in some ways, I kind of realized that this was a good thing. One reason Mosaic is important is that they were going to be multi-platform. They were going to do an X Windows / Unix version. They were going to do a Windows version. And they're going to do a Mac version. So like Viola only ran on a Unix version. It didn't have really Mac versions or anything else. And we knew that wasn't a good thing if you wanted to spread widely. So so one is it was professing to solve that multi-platform issue, and you could have Mosaic on the platform of your choice. And the second, was that Mosaic simply was more stable than Viola, easier to install. Viola was a system in which an application was a web browser, and so you could have problems with the system, you could have problems with the application. I think Mosaic was a simpler code base, and it worked. It did what it wanted. Now, the challenge then was, well, Mark was kind of, if you control the interface, which later on we saw this happen with Microsoft and others, if you control the front end, you kind of dictate the standards for the web, because, why would you, if you want to add in a tag to HTML, it's all dependent on the browser being able to interpret that tag.
Well, for example, like the image tag famously.
Yes. And that was actually the one outcome of that is, at the time, it sounds almost like an arcane battle in a way, but there was the command line browsers and the visual browsers, or graphical, user interface browsers that could, the latter could display images, the former couldn't. And, the command line browsers, people developing them wanted to know how to handle the image tag. And they couldn't obviously display the image in any way. And so the one thing that I know came out of that workshop was the alt tag for the image browser. And it allowed you to supply text in place of the image. If you couldn't render the image, you could fall back and display the text. Now, for me, that had a real specific example. Is I wanted to use visuals to convey what GNN was. I wanted to have the words GNN in an image. And if you couldn't display that image, you could display this alt text. But you didn't want to display both. You didn't want to have the image and then have GNN as text. You wanted to be able to switch between the two given the browser. Mm. But I think that was, for me, that was a victory, getting that kind of change in there. But I think it was an opportunity for 30 people to come together and who had been web developers relatively recently, who had experience and knowledge, and get to know each other. NCSA brought about 5 or 6 programmers.
And Andreessen was one of them?
Andreessen was one of them. And then, the other browsers I mentioned were represented there as well.
Lou Montulli,
Lou Montulli from Lynx, and I can't. There was Chris who did the Windows browser.
Chris Wilson,
I think, and Alexander did the Mac browser. But it was a chance for us to meet each other. I think we went to dinner in an Italian restaurant, kind of in the basement where they had kind of stars on the ceiling. It was kind of it was sort of bizarre, but and I think it gave us a chance to start talking about what Joseph from NCSA kind of ran the group there, which included Mark, and going on a walk for him, and we were talking about, well, there kind of needs to be a sort of standards organization that manages this process of deciding what goes in there, or otherwise. The way it kind of looked at the time is Mark could willy-nilly make a decision about what to add to the browser, and everybody would have to go along with it, whether they wanted to or not. And Mark was really smart and did not make bad decisions, I'll say that. But nonetheless, to sort of look at the web as a whole, you wanted to kind of think about how could you have a way that ideas were vetted and agreed upon by some set of folks that had an interest in it, or stakeholders.
And eventually that would be the W3C. But just to be clear, Tim Berners-Lee was at this as well, correct?
Yes, he was. Yeah, and he kind of led it. I mean, you have to think about, in some ways, there's an age dynamic. Mark is I don't know if he was sophomore or junior, but he's pretty young. He's full of fire. He certainly believed he was the smartest person in the room. And, Tim had, this was kind of Tim's baby. And, there were times when I think Mark was snickering at what Tim would say, and, not either in disagreement or as a, somewhat sophomoric way of participating. And I wasn't sure what to do about all of that. But the fact that they hadn't met and hadn't talked previously, was all I, in some ways, could remedy. That putting these people together, at least they get to know each other and realize that we all have to work together, and that it doesn't belong to one person.
Well, just real quickly, and then we'll get back to GNN. Did you get the impression that maybe like Andreessen represented a different vision for what the web could become than what Tim Berners-Lee had, perhaps? No,
it's probably more on tactics and vision. It's just sort of like, it's sort of young programmer, I can fix that, and just let me do it. It's like the quick and dirty solution versus, let's talk it over and think about it and explore alternatives. They're just sort of different ways of doing things. And, for Mark, it was just, hey, it's just code. I could do this in 10 minutes, versus like, and not since Tim represented this, but, a large company that might have, a specification, a review of the specification, a code review and testing and all these other steps. This is just sort of the Wild West. You just go out and change it and put it out there and it's done.
All right, so let's get back to the story of GNN, because you had been working on this earlier in 1993, and so tell me about what you imagined Global Network Navigator would be about.
Well, I thought its core features were sort of a catalog, as I said, sort of here's a bunch of stuff, here's how to find out about things on the internet. And a bit like a card catalog, it had, a hierarchical organization. You look up a topic like agriculture or, or something else, and you would find a list of sites in there. But I also kind of wanted to add something that was like a magazine, meaning it was articles or information about things that are going on. And as we developed it, we kind of had sections. So if you think about, an area like travel, we were linking out to sites that, such as, a State Department site that might have information about, for world travel. And then, to some degree, we'd be writing about an article on travel, not necessarily a standard like travel log, but like how you might use the internet to do travel or other things like that, or how someone who's going out and like adventure travel and kind of how they're planning their trip and how they're doing this. Some of it was initially there wasn't a whole lot of internet to cover there. It was a little bit more basic travel stuff, but the idea is that we could cover some of the information that you got in print or elsewhere, and try to put that together.
So you have the guide, and then you're adding in news. Is it sort of just like news about the internet and about the web and that sort of thing? Yeah,
but it's more articles, I would say, than news, and it's more feature oriented, like like you say, travel. It wasn't. I have to say, I wasn't that clear about what we were doing there, except I felt it wanted to be more consumer oriented than technical, and I wanted to. What I thought was real interesting. I mean, I did this kind of almost on a daily basis, is just introduce people to the internet, not as a technology, but as this kind of information interface. You can find things that, boy, you could never get to even in a library. You could really go to the source directly. And that's what fascinated me. Did you know that just came up from London? It's a map of this, and, over here, it just came from, Orlando, Florida. It's a website over there. And I went around talking to people about this, and they kind of at the time confused the browser with the web a lot, and they thought, like, where do I buy that software? And it was like, well, you get the software to browse the internet, but then you're going out on the internet and using that. It's not like there's a CD-ROM with all this data on it that you put in your computer. So it was a shift in how people were thinking about things.
And also, you're starting to experiment with commerce and things like that, because there's another component of GNN is the marketplace. Can you describe what you were starting to do with things like the marketplace? Well,
when we launched GNN at the next year's Interop in August of '93, there was an article that based on the announcement in the Wall Street Journal, and it was sort of advertising comes to the internet. And I think in conversations with some of the people that were building GNN with me, Rob Raish is one of them, and Tim OReilly, we thought, well, this is probably an advertising business model here, that things are free to everybody, but we kind of get sponsors for it. What we thought at the time, and was maybe a little bit naive, that the marketplace and the internet could be where you told a story that other people could care about. It was it was Thanksgiving coffee, could tell the story about how they source their coffee beans and how they're different than others. That's not something that they do in traditional ads that have one page in a magazine or 30 seconds on a radio. That you could actually give people an opportunity to explore in more depth information about a product or service. And so that's kind of the direction we had for what advertising could be on the internet. And it was, the idea certainly was that they would help sponsor the site, pay for its operations, and underwrite the work of a team to produce content that other people care about. So it's in some ways a traditional media model.
Mm-hmm. Sort of akin to the magazine model, the print magazine model.
Yeah. Not too far from that.
So the legend holds that the very first advertiser was a law firm that buys a sponsored link on GNN. Is that how you remember it as well? Yeah,
it was Heller Ehrman, and it was Dan Heller was our lawyer for O'Reilly, so we convinced them to spend some money with us, and they actually can claim that. There was just it was really an informational link, just saying, hey, in our marketplace, here's Heller Ehrman Law Firm, here's what they do, and go learn more about it.
And that was in maybe early '94. I'm pretty sure that this is before Hotwire does its experiments with banner ads. Correct?
Yeah, this is when we launched in '93, at least with the Heller Ehrman.
Okay.
There's something that happens later, which is more in the banner advertising mode, want me to just jump into that?
Sure.
I'm not clear on the timing.
Yeah.
94, but it might be a whole year, 94.
Go ahead.
So as the browser started to take off, particularly Mosaic, the most visited page on the internet or the web was the What's New page. And it's where, if you created a new site, you would try to get listed on this site. So it was popular. It was well trafficked, but NCSA, they recognized the value of it, but they really weren't a publishing group that had people that cared about it. So it was sort of like the programmers would have to go add sites to that list in their spare time when they were doing code. And so knowing Joseph and others, I asked them if we could basically license the page and maintain it for them, and that we would try to sell advertising on it. And that's, is what happened. And we began updating it more regularly. So but it was because it was the most traffic page on the internet. We thought, well, this is better than anything we have in GNN. This is the place where we can get advertising. And we did sell a banner ad to MasterCard on that, and they, that was our first example of banner ads. At the top of this NCSA What's New page, and as I said, I believe that was in '94.
Mm-hmm. So by the end of '94, and I guess with your tie-in with the NCSA What's New page, GNN becomes quite popular. Like I think by the end of '94, you're already serving millions of hits and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any attempt to like do registration or anything like that at this time, or you're just still sticking with we're serving up media and paying for it with ads?
Yeah, pretty much that. I don't recall if we had registration almost ever. So many of these things were kind of new. Even how would you capture like forums and other things? Some of that came a little bit later. Our biggest problem at the time was just keeping up with things. Like the catalog had to be updated so much. There's so many things coming online. I mean, the ideal thing was the NCSA What's New page gave us a glimpse at what's new on the web, and then we wanted to organize that into the catalog so that you could find it again, put it in the right topic or do that. And at the time, I basically had to hire librarians because they kind of knew the information problems there, and I thought they did a really great job of adapting to the web and figuring that kind of stuff out. So it was really how do you, we had no sense of doing this algorithmically or in any automated way. It was just throwing people at it to keep track of what's going on, looking for things or getting notified of things, and then figuring out where to put it and update it.
So by '95 or so, you're successful enough with the ads and things like that I think I had read that your head count reaches like 25 or 30 people just at GNN. Mm-hmm. And so what do you have any recollection of what sort of ad rates you're able to get from people like MasterCard and Zima and early advertisers like that?
Yeah, I don't really, but it wasn't enormous. It might be in the $10,000 to $20,000 range, for a month campaign or longer. But our challenge at the time was how do you finance the growth of this? It wasn't going to produce enough revenue on its own to do that, and yet we needed sort of more resources than what we had.
I have another question, sort of backtracking just a bit, but when you launch in '93, it's still kind of the gray area where are you even allowed to do commercial things on the internet? Did you ever get any sort of feedback about that? Like you're not supposed to be doing this on the internet at that point?
We thought we might, but we didn't get really anything that amounts to that. I think there might be there was this kind of funny thing is the idea of the commercial internet in some ways was to make the internet available to everybody. And those who wanted it not to be commercial ended up sort of arguing that it should just be limited to researchers and academics who had set up the network originally. And so I think their position didn't really, it was hard to sort of defend that position that that was a great free resource for the elite, but everybody else should kind of stay off it. And I think the similar issue of we were a company and not an academic institution or something like that. But partially because our books, the Unix background, and Tim's advocacy for lots of things. I think it never amounted to an argument against it.
So
or mitigated any argument.
Right. Everything in this time period is so compressed. Everything seems to move so fast at the beginning of the web here. So GNN is only it started in 93, and then is it 95 or 96 that AOL purchases it?
Yeah, I think it's 95.
Uh-huh.
And I don't, it was, I believe, in the fall time frame,
Mm-hmm.
so it could have closed in 96, but it was 95 when that, we got approached and did a deal with them.
I had read from other GNN people that went on to AOL after this acquisition. I had read that they said that in retrospect, it seemed like it was a defensive purchase by AOL, that AOL didn't really want to do anything with it, but they just wanted to keep it out of somebody else's hands.
Yeah, I think it's probably true. I think AOL, so from our point of view, we needed more resources to grow it. There was an opportunity here, but we couldn't scale it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I have to say, it's, when you're behind that, when you're in that place, it's really a hard place to be because everybody's working really hard and the amount of work just increases, the amount of competition starts to increase, and you just don't know what to do. Tim did not want to take money into O'Reilly to finance it, and we probably could have spun it out and got some finance, but at the time, nobody really thought there was commercial potential in the internet. I'm sorry, there just wasn't a lot
Mm-hmm.
going on, and even things like search engines like Alta Vista were sort of sponsored by companies and run with Skunkworks projects. So I can't tell you how many meetings I had with people and say, yeah, this is all cool, but I don't see any business here. Not
Mm-hmm.
just GNN, but just the internet as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Because I did a lot of evangelizing, with ad agencies, with companies, and even I remember going to Microsoft and having them sort of poo-poo the internet. It just wasn't. There's nothing here, And I think partly one of the real interesting things about the early web is how, in a sense, it really was run by amateurs and run by almost non-computer scientists. It was, I always found in talking to more experienced computer scientists that they underestimated the web because it wasn't that complex a system, and that's what they thought something had to be, to be successful. So like even the early hypertext systems, the challenge was, well, how do you manage all those addresses in a system? You need a central database that's going to grow enormously to know how to find the content that might be out on the network. And, Tim Berners-Lee solved that in an ingenious way that one time he told me, he says, well, I thought of addresses just like the postal system. You can mail something to an address and you might get it back, says return, sender, recipient not at that address, or, and so return to sender. In other words, he didn't have a central database. He just had the address as a way of getting to a place, and what you expect to be there may not be there. And the system could break, and it was okay. And I thought it was a really fascinating difference in approach, that he had actually avoided solving a really difficult problem that others thought he should have solved.
I'm gonna, Dale. I don't want to take up too much of your time. You've been so generous already, but there's two more, just real quickly.
Sure.
Two more questions. One would be about one of your claims to fame is founding the term, or coining the term Web 2.0 and co-founding the first Web 2.0 conferences. Could you just describe for me? We haven't gotten to this point in our chronology yet, but when Web 2.0 comes around in 2004, 2005, that feeling of, the bust has happened, the dot-com bust has happened, but gee, things aren't over yet. There's still tons of innovation happening. Can you describe that period of time a little bit?
Yeah. No, I felt like after the bust had happened, people were say, well, that's over. Let's go find the next big thing. And it sort of is my own view of being involved in the early web. What I liked was the people that showed up with great ideas and great energy to build a website. And they didn't know that there was a business in it or not. They just had an idea, but the web was open enough that they could execute that idea and make it public. And I thought that was the sort of the core of the web that I loved. And as it even gone through its first 10 years, at the end of that, it was sort of like those weren't the people there anymore. They were the people that, that were making really big bets on how fast consumers would adopt the web and sell things or buy things. And, it was really, really all about the money. And so when that kind of went away, it was sort of like a breath of fresh air. And I began, but what led me to the Web 2.0 was, in many ways, a practical example was Rob Kalish and a few other people starting Etsy. And, they were just going to build a web marketplace. And they thought they could do it on their own. They didn't care about funding. They had their own vision of what to do, why to do it. And it was almost like it made me feel like this is a whole new generation of people who realize that the web provides them with a framework to, build the things that they care about. They don't, and it's open. And I thought Tim was also talking about the web, open source and the web as a platform. And I thought sort of bringing that together is like, hey, the web is still exists, and in fact, it's evolved to the point where it's easier to build things, and you don't have to build from the bottom up, but you can build on top of other things, like in the sense of having a stack. And and I thought in general the market was kind of just sort of crazy that there were more people buying online than ever. It was still growing. It was still successful, but it was really the Silicon Valley investors had turned away from it. And I just thought, well, this is, the next new thing is the web all over again. And that's why I called it Web 2.0.
And so finally, you might be best known today as the sort of the godfather of the maker movement, of founder of Make Magazine, Maker Fairs, all that sort of thing. So if you wanted to end by just telling us a little bit about the state of the maker movement today.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, if you think about when I look back and I think, what I've kind of, as a pattern, looked for enthusiasts, and I've looked for people that I really trust what they're doing because it means something to them. And then same time I was looking at the Web 2.0, the Rob Kalish's, I just found people hacking physical things, hacking TiVo boxes, and I thought that's interesting. It's not Facebook, it's not a web app, a mobile app, and it's not a social app. It's people building robots and people building physical things with electronics and other things. And I just thought, well, nobody else is going in that direction. I want to go in that direction because I see people there. I like what they're doing, and there's something there. And it's just almost from a gut perspective, like that's what I want to follow. And I came up with the idea for Make Magazine. And really going back and looking at magazines like Popular Science and Popular Mechanics in the 20th century, and how they really had kind of a hacker attitude. I can do this, and it's fun. It's satisfying. And I wanted to capture that, and somehow I think, that kind of did sort of light a spark for people, some of whom were already makers, and increasingly I think people who never saw that in themselves, but now discover it or believe they can develop themselves as makers.
So you would almost say that the through line to your career is you've always gone in the direction of where people were passionate about something, whether there was money there or not. They just were interested.
Yeah.
They had this passion inside them.
Yeah, and it's almost like the pre-commercial side of this,
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to commercial stuff. But I think it's true with Tim too, with open source and other things. But it is there's a sense of dedication and a sense of play that's particular in the Make thing that I thought these people, are playing with technologies to learn about it and see what it's good for, and they will discover, the opportunities faster than those who aren't doing it. And that really, that really captures my attention.
Well, Dale Dougherty, thank you so much for telling us not only the story of GNN, but also into the present day Web 2.0 and the Maker movement. Thank you so much for remembering all that for us.
Thank you very much for asking a good question.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.